Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next Nomensa webinar installment. This month's webinar is hosted by Principal UX Consultant here at Nomensa, Luiza Frederico. In today's webinar, Luiza is going to be looking at the ways in which you can be more vulnerable as an individual, team, or business leader in order to improve work culture and business outcomes. As usual, please join in the discussion in the chat. Just make sure your chat settings are switched to everyone and not just hosts and panelists. And that way everyone can see your messages. And if you've got any questions for Luiza, you can submit them using the Q&A function, and I'll run through as many as I can at the end. Finally, we're using auto-generated captions from Rev. There is a chance they might get a bit muddled, as is the nature of these things, but we'll make sure these are tidied up when we post the recording on YouTube. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Luiza, to kick things off.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Luiza, and I'm here to talk to you about vulnerability. It really is still a taboo topic. It makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable, but I'm here to tell you why it's really beneficial to apply it in your day-to-day life, and especially at work. A lot of people might avoid this topic completely because, like I said, it's an uncomfortable thing to talk about. So well done for being here today. Thanks for joining us. I don't think I'm going to be talking about anything necessarily groundbreaking, but hopefully I'm going to be shedding a light or providing a new perspective on this topic so that by the end of this talk, you can feel inspired to put it into practice in your everyday life. So let's get started. And I'd like to actually start us off by saying that this is a topic that I'm really passionate about. If anyone has tuned into my previous talks, you will start to see a bit of a pattern here, other than the fact that my headshot picture needs to be updated. I'll make sure I do that for my next webinar. But yes, I am extremely interested in emotional intelligence as a topic and how this can be applied in your work life. If you are interested to look up my previous talks, you can have a look on the Nomensa YouTube channel, and you can find them there. But you know what, like I'm actually a very emotionally sensitive person by nature, which is why I've always had a really big interest in this topic. And this interest goes back a long time for me. I started reading up on emotional design when I was doing my GCSEs a long time ago. But I'm really glad that over the years, this has become a topic that's more openly spoken about, and it's not something that people are shying away from anymore. And I'd like to touch on real quick on my postgraduate degree, where I focused my research on emotional intelligence. I specifically researched if design could promote emotional development in early years education. Turns out it can in lots of ways. And turns out that the act of designing in of itself is a really powerful way to develop emotional intelligence. So if you work in the creative industry or even in business, if you're problem solving, etc., you're probably developing your emotional intelligence without even knowing it. And I really am a true believer that emotional development is really the foundation of being a really healthy and well-rounded human being. So when I talk about emotional intelligence, what is it that I'm talking about? I mean, there's lots of domains and competencies and things that it affects, but mainly if we look at this table, it affects things like your self-awareness and self-management, your social awareness, and your relationship management. So if you read through these different things, they're pretty important things to develop, right? If you're going to be effective in your personal life and also in business. Right? So how does all of this link with vulnerability, and what is vulnerability? This wouldn't be a webinar without a good old definition slide, so here it is. The word vulnerability actually comes from the Latin word vulnus, meaning wound. And the actual definition in English is that it's the state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. But I kind of like to see it as the uncomfortable emotion that we feel when we experience times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Now, many of us feel this type of feeling all the time. You might have felt it when you're talking openly about your feelings or asking for help, getting feedback, maybe doing a webinar, talking to your team about difficult topics. Maybe you're admitting or apologizing when you've done something wrong. Maybe you've made a mistake or you failed at something and you're trying again after that failure. Or maybe it's something as simple as singing karaoke in front of your friends. Some people would die on the inside at the prospect of doing that. I, on the other hand, will hog the mic. You do feel a little uncomfortable, but you get what I'm saying. There's vulnerability in so many of these different things that we do in our lives. And I wanted to share a little something with you, actually. I am currently feeling very vulnerable, not only because I'm doing a webinar. Public speaking always makes you feel a little bit vulnerable. When I get started, I always feel a little bit nervous. But I am feeling really vulnerable right now because I'm nearly 7 months pregnant right now with my first child. This feels like a really great time of uncertainty for me, risk, emotional exposure, and especially for my professional life, because I have all of these questions going on in my head. How can I afford being off of work for so long? How is a baby going to change my life? How am I going to change? Is my career under threat? You know, there's all of these things going on at the moment, and they're all unknowns, and it makes you feel uncomfortable. Luckily, I was able to speak with my manager and HR very early on, so I feel very supported at work, which is really great. But I can share with you right now that I had many moments, especially in those first 3 months, where I couldn't really show my vulnerability to everyone, and it really sucked. So for example, doing client presentations, and you kind of have to be on point and bring good energy, when actually I'm just salivating like mad and I feel like I'm about to be sick every minute, or being overwhelmed by fatigue and having to nap between team meetings just to get through the day. You know, all of these things are difficult things to go through, but I had to power through them. But powering through those moments without showing my vulnerability, it worked in the short term, but it's not really good for your well-being if you're doing it in the long term. Now, luckily, like I said, I couldn't be vulnerable with everyone in those first 3 months. Most of you will know that people tend to wait a little bit before they share the news. But I was able to be vulnerable with a few trusted people at work and in my personal life. And that helped me so, so much. So there's different levels of vulnerability that you can choose to have with people around you. And the reason why vulnerability is so uncomfortable is fear. It's a massive barrier to vulnerability. We feel scared when there's a risk to our physical or our emotional safety. And vulnerability is synonymous still with weakness, fragility, you know, people that need looking after, like vulnerable children and the elderly. And our survival instincts tell us not to put ourselves in vulnerable positions. We're social animals, so our survival depends on belonging to a social group, being a useful and valuable member of the group. So actually, whilst our daily decisions and actions aren't really life or death, our bodies and our brains make us think that they are because of this evolutionary makeup. So it's very human to feel this. You would have to be a psychopath to not feel vulnerable in your day-to-day life. But you may choose not to be vulnerable because you might fear rejection, or you might fear that you might hurt others in the process, or you're scared that what you say is going to be used against you. And some of these things, and especially a couple of these, are linked with shame, feelings of shame. And I couldn't talk about vulnerability without bringing up Brené Brown. Brené Brown is a leading authority on the topics of shame and vulnerability. So if you're interested in this stuff, do read up on her books. But shame does play a significant role in what it means to be vulnerable. And it can really be amplified if you have low self-confidence, maybe a lack of social support, previous traumas maybe, but it's rooted in this belief that you're not worthy. And shame, feelings of shame, results in you feeling anxious, which all hold us back from being vulnerable. But ultimately, it takes a lot of courage and a lot of energy for you to be vulnerable, for you to meet your fears. It's really not an easy thing to do. So as I'm talking about it, easier said than done, I know, but it does take a lot of courage for you to step up. And one of the things that you have to do here to have that courage to meet your fear is to have this self-love, is to understand your own worthiness, to understand that you belong, and to have the confidence to show up, to be vulnerable, and so to learn to have compassion for yourself, to be kinder to yourself in the process. And it's only when you can do this with yourself that you can in turn do this with others. Now, if you're going to be vulnerable, or in fact, if you're going to avoid vulnerability, it kind of means that we're kind of staying in our comfort zone. And as a society, we do have a tendency to avoid uncomfortable feelings, whether it's scrolling on social media or binging on Netflix, keeping ourselves really, really busy so we just don't have that time alone with our thoughts, maybe drinking wine or other kind of escapism. But actually, by avoiding the vulnerability, you're really staying firm in that comfort zone. But your comfort zone isn't always a benchmark of what good looks like. And like I said, to be vulnerable is to be human. We're all going to experience it throughout our lives, both in our personal lives and at work. And that's going to change depending on the challenges that face you in your day-to-day life. But just like any other muscle in your body, you have to exercise your mental fitness, and vulnerability is a great way to help you do this. But you'd need to have the courage to overcome that fear in order for you to learn, in order for you to grow. It's worth saying, like I said, it's a lifelong thing. This isn't like a one-time class, a one-time workshop, and the work is done. Just like eating and sleeping, you have to do it every single day, but it does get better and it does get easier. So why is vulnerability important? There is so much literature on this topic, and especially now it's becoming a bit of a trendy word, I guess, vulnerability, or I guess like a bit of a buzzword. But there are lots of benefits on vulnerability, and I've summarized some points here for us. But it can help you develop bonds with other people. It can increase that trust and loyalty that you have with others. It can increase your emotional and your self-expression. It boosts your overall emotional intelligence and your emotional resilience. And overall, it increases engagement and contribution. So by being vulnerable and creating those relationships, you are becoming more invested, either in other people or in a business, for example. So actually, I think that covering up your vulnerability, like toughing it out and pretending to be unfazed or just powering through, like in my view, I think these things are really overrated and probably just harmful for you and your well-being and to those around you as well. As human beings, we have this core need to belong, to feel like we're part of something, to feel safe, to feel like we're contributing. And to create an environment that allows for vulnerability can provide all of these different things. So we're going to talk about vulnerability specifically at work. And before we do, I'd love to get a little bit of a sense of how often everyone here feels vulnerable at work. So drop us a quick message on the chat. We're going to have a quick look here, but how often do you feel vulnerable at work? Is it multiple times a day? Is it daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly? So yeah, let us know how often you feel vulnerable. I'll have the chat open here to have a look. I'll tell you that for myself, most days I have, moments where I'm feeling vulnerable. And, it's the more that you practice, this kind of ability to be vulnerable. So not only to feel it, but to express it to others. The more that you can kind of get over that fear of being vulnerable. And I can see here from the chat, some people say every day, daily, most days, weekly. So pretty often, really. I'd be surprised if anyone was to say that just once a year, but yeah, there you go, Kath. A couple of times over the last 6 months, but yeah, I'm guessing there's lots of different ways that you can feel vulnerable, right? And there's different levels of that as well. So we're going to be exploring some of these in our chat today. So I'd like to start off just by saying that, people do business with people. This is a very well-known quote. Most of you would have heard this, but, whether you work in a business or you run a business, this relies really heavily on building relationships with others. So whether it's employer, employee, partners, colleagues, clients, customers, suppliers, investors, there's a whole ecosystem of human beings that you need to build bridges with and relationships with. And vulnerability is important in relationship building because it signals teamwork to other people instead of dominance. And this is really important because teamwork and collaboration relies heavily on healthy working relationships. And vulnerability allows people to connect on a different level that leads to increased collaboration, productivity, cohesiveness. It really fuels the strongest relationships and really transforms performance that brings more success to an organization. And like I said before, when people feel connected, whether it's to you, to a team, to a business, they feel more invested in that. They feel like they will engage more, they will contribute more. And all of this is really important to understand as a leader, especially, because leadership isn't about being in charge. It's not about that dominance. It's about taking care of people in our charge by creating the right environment for them to perform, for them to succeed, and to generate results. And there's this really cool woman called Esther Wojcicki. She's the mother to 3 very successful women. One of her daughters is CEO of YouTube. The other is co-founder and CEO of 23andMe. And the other is a doctor and professor of pediatrics. Now, this woman, this mom of 3 amazing, successful people, wrote this book called How to Raise Successful People. And she really focuses on how it's important to create an environment that breeds trust, respect, independence, collaboration, and kindness. And it's all about creating that environment to let people thrive and generate those results for the business. And I talk about these things because when we're talking to employers about what skills are they looking for in people, they say, we're looking for creative and adaptable people. We want them to be emotionally intelligent, critical thinkers, good communicators and collaborators, independent, lifelong learners. And this is coming from recruitment companies or business publishers such as Forbes, etc. So there's, lots of different sources out there that will tell you this stuff. But I think, unfortunately, the environments that we work in can still promote certain behaviors and patterns which are not really conducive to developing these skills. One in particular, or a great example of this, is this command and control leadership style, which many of you might have experienced or be familiar with. But the command and control style is a very hierarchical leadership style that took hold in the 50s and 60s. And it was started by people that were coming back from World War II and stepping into business leadership. So as you can imagine, it's very kind of army-driven, very hierarchical, but ultimately it's inflexible, it's really rigid, and removing that empowerment and agency that the team has. So not only is it removing or hurting your team's ability to make decisions, their ability to innovate, it's also making employees unhappy. And these command and control environments, unfortunately, are also really associated with the patriarchy, another uncomfortable word to bring up in a webinar, but here we go. And I wanted to bring this up real quick, just because I think that gender and vulnerability is a really interesting topic to discuss or just to be aware of. mainly because in the society that we live in, which is very patriarchal, it does cause men to experience vulnerability as a weakness or something to be shameful of. So men do tend to struggle a bit more with vulnerability. But it also makes women perceive their self-care as being selfish or expressing honest views as being aggressive. If you are interested in this topic in general, there's a great documentary on Netflix called Beyond Men and Masculinity. And one of the things that it explores is how boys in our society are still being raised to see feelings, emotions, as a feminine weakness. And because still, unfortunately, there is nothing worse for a boy than being compared to a girl, right? It's nothing like good old toxic masculinity. But the reason, again, that I'm bringing this up is because there are qualities which are traditionally considered feminine, such as empathy, collaboration, and intuition, that have long gone unrecognized in traditional workplace cultures when you compare it to traditionally masculine qualities, such as being direct, being competitive, being assertive. And we all know that there are loads of men that embody these traditionally feminine qualities and loads of women that embody these traditional masculine qualities. And I can speak from my own experience as a woman that I had these ideas in my head about what it meant to be assertive, I guess. And I really struggled with this. I really struggled with my communication. And not because I wasn't naturally assertive, because I think that I am. I feel like I'm opinionated and assertive by nature. But I was really scared that if I was honest about that, if I really let that shine through at work, that I was going to come across as rude. So I was holding that back. So my comfort zone was around being agreeable and polite. And, I was avoiding that risk at work. And I did some communication training. I did assertiveness training to overcome my own mental hurdles about all of this. And I can tell you that it transformed my work life and my career, because now I can embody qualities on both sides of the spectrum without fear of being judged and without my own mental hurdles on this. And I really feel like it's made me a better team member, a better leader, a better employee in general. So vulnerability means connecting with your authentic self, regardless of whether the qualities are seen as traditionally feminine or masculine. So I would urge all of you to think about how this might be affecting you or might have affected you in the past. And if you do have any stories that you're comfortable with sharing, again, please do put them on the chat so that we can have a look after. And one of the things about this that makes people really uncomfortable is that, they really kind of struggle to trust the environment that they're in. And, the thing is with trust is that in order for you to have a team that performs really well, it really does require members of that team to trust each other. And, to have this trust as a team isn't just motivational for people, but it does increase that collaboration, the innovation, creative thinking, productivity. And this is especially true in really fast-paced, high-stakes, multidisciplinary environments where we're really interdependent on each other for success. And a creative agency or design agency is a perfect example of that. But it is really hard for you to trust your team if the environment that you're in or your employer or people that you work with, like that environment in general, makes you feel belittled, afraid to be yourself. It makes you struggle to speak up or to participate and engage authentically in work. But, going back to the whole kind of patriarchy and how things have changed over time in terms of society and gender norms, our workforce has also changed a lot since the 60s. And our society has changed a lot in that time as well. But there's still a lot of catching up to do in society and especially in business. So ultimately, if you kind of take a step back, though, forget about being man, woman, whatever, Ultimately, if you're in business, you're almost always vulnerable, because every time you're trying something new or having a difficult conversation, every time you make a mistake, big or small, every time you try to implement something and maybe you don't have full support from everyone, so you're not pleasing everyone, every time you're saying no to something, you are feeling vulnerable. So I'm going to take you through some of my top tips to practice vulnerability at work. And you will notice that as we go through these, that the more responsibility you have, so going from the individual to the team leader to the business leader, the more these tips will apply to you. And as we do go through, again, please do use the chat to share if you struggle with any of these specific things, if you feel comfortable sharing with the group, that is. So let's make a start on vulnerability as an individual. And the first thing is around asking questions and sharing ideas. It's important that we all have confidence in our abilities and our thoughts and ideas, and to be prepared to engage and exchange those. Now, the diversity of thought, the diversity of opinions and ideas that we have in a team are the birthplace of innovation. But in order for this to happen, you really have to feel comfortable with sharing the idea to start off with, but also just know that your idea isn't going to be the winning idea every time. And that's okay. You need to be prepared to challenge other people's ideas, but be prepared to be challenged yourself, and be prepared for people to not like your idea. But that's okay. Like, what's the worst that can happen? Sometimes you need lots of little ideas that aren't that great to make up or to influence or inspire the one great idea that you have as a team. So very important just to have the courage to step up and put your ideas out there. And this is the same for questions as well. You'd be really surprised how often I ask questions because something's not clear for me. And immediately after, I'll get loads of DMs from either team members or other people going, "I'm so glad you asked that question because I was wondering the same thing." And it's like, how many people are just sat there quietly not asking questions because, they just don't have the courage to voice them. They would rather not know than maybe appear silly for asking the question in the first place. So put yourself out there is the first tip. The second one is around being okay with being imperfect. Be honest about your shortcomings and your weaknesses. And this is hard to do at work, right? Because, you're getting paid to do a job. And if you're admitting to not being good at something, those interests kind of contradict each other. So this is a really hard thing to do. But we're only human and we are fallible. We will fail. It's guaranteed. One of the best bits of advice I ever got from a senior team member when I was younger was that we're all winging it. We're all just trying our best. And I remember when I heard that, it took a massive weight off my shoulders. It's like, everyone looks like they've got it all together. Am I the only one who's trying to figure this out? So yeah, just remember, no one's perfect. You're going to fail. And that's okay. So stop masking your emotions, stop pretending that you've got it all figured out, and just open up about what you really need. Again, it comes back to asking questions as well, but be okay with failure. There's a really interesting article that I saw where a CEO was talking about her philosophy of failing 5 times a day. So she said, "I only have a bad day if I fail 6 times that day." And the reason she did that is so that she felt okay with failure, so that she had a bigger threshold for failure. So she wasn't beating herself up for every tiny little mistake that she might make on that one day. So that's a good thing to remember. Being authentic. This is another really hard thing to do for some people, because maybe the person that you are outside of work is a little bit different from who you are at work. So it's really important for you to be true to yourself, despite the possibility of rejection. It's important for you to engage in your own self-discovery, to stand by your values, and to fight the tendency to just be agreeable. So I'm not saying here that you should wear your heart on your sleeve all the time and that you overshare everything and that you're not being professional at work. It's not about that. It's about balance. but without losing sight of yourself. And again, diversity, is so important in a team, and so much value can be had from a diverse set of views, of backgrounds. So bring that value to the table. Don't just become a reflection of what other people expect from you, because that's not the full value that you bring to the table. And like I said a second ago, it's about embracing yourself so that you can embrace others. But being authentic, again, this doesn't mean giving you permission to disrespect other people or to be rude. All of this has to be done with respect and with kindness. And finally, it's around setting boundaries. And you can't be all things to all people all of the time. You need to communicate and enforce those boundaries around behaviors, around time, around respect. And this makes vulnerability possible because, and one of the key things here is that you're having to draw a line. You're having to say no to things because you're not saying yes to everything. I know too many yes people, we probably all do. And I'm actually one of them in a way. I was definitely one for a very long time. This is something that I struggle with a lot and I'm still working on, but this is one of the things that you need to do as an act of self-care, which is to draw a line somewhere and to be okay with saying no. There is a risk that people might not like you as much, or that they might be, upset that you're not saying yes to them all the time. That will happen. It will be uncomfortable, but it's an important thing for you to do for yourself. So let's move on to vulnerability as a team leader. And the first thing I'll say is that you need to lead by example. Be vulnerable with your team. You need to model the behavior for them so people can see that and go, okay, if my manager is doing that, then it's okay for me to do that too. You need to create and nurture that right environment and that culture. And ultimately, you need to enable other people to show their vulnerability so that they feel connected to you, to the team, to the business, and so they feel invested and respected within that space. And I can really say that when managers, especially, struggle with showing their vulnerability, it can have a really devastating effect on the rest of the workforce. So definitely something to keep an eye on. And this is really linked with the aspects of psychological safety. Some of us might have heard this term if you work in sort of agile environments, but ultimately it's about creating that safe space. So, people feel okay telling you when things aren't going right, and you can create that space for us to kind of do something about it and grow as a team. But the key thing here is about keeping your judgment in check. Passing on judgment actually destroys trust and connection. Judgment, generally speaking, is actually, or often, a self-protection strategy. It's a way for you to distance yourself from things that you fear or things that you dislike, but it shuts people down. It stops them from sharing problems. It stops them from sharing mistakes, and it destroys trust and connection. And again, in order to kind of do this, one of the things you should be thinking about is, how do you destroy the view that everything and everyone is perfect and needs to succeed first time? You need to build that trust with your team, create that sense of belonging, give them a sense of agency. And we're not trying to say here that we're trying to encourage kind of self-deprecation or to avoid holding people accountable when they make mistakes. Like, that's not it at all. Like, accountability is very important, and people shouldn't be putting themselves down just to try and make other people feel better. And equally, we're not trying to create a team full of snowflakes, as some people would say, but it's about building relationships that are based on trust, based on respect and kindness, and to create that environment that allows for a healthy emotional connection, emotional growth, and resilience as well. On a very similar topic, understanding your team's vulnerabilities and helping them to develop those soft skills is really important. Helping them to develop their self-control, their emotional resilience, their adaptability, and having those emotionally intelligent conversations and communication with them so that you can understand individuals' preferences, their values, their personalities, so that you can understand the impacts that they're having on themselves, on others, and create a truly collaborative dynamic and approach within the team. We mentioned this earlier, but in the short term, having this sort of toughness and I'm just going to work through it, in the short term, stuff like that can be great because it can help you through really tricky situations. But in the longer term, it can drive you towards unhealthy behaviors like masking your real feelings. It creates barriers within the team, and it potentially reduces the trust that you have amongst the team as well. So as a manager, you need to look out and understand people on an individual level so you can tell when these behaviors have gone from like a healthy short-term fix to an unhealthy long-term solution. And finally, a sense of purpose. It's really important to give people a sense of achievement and giving them goals, things to work forward to. People want to have a purpose. They want to feel like they're making a difference. Being really honest about their strengths and shortcomings can really help people feel comfortable discussing their development as well as their strengths. Like we said, giving and getting feedback is really hard. But again, having an honest, open conversation about these things and creating that environment that makes people safe enough to do that, so that ultimately they're building not only a connection with themselves, having that self-awareness, but then they can build that connection with the team and the business as well. Finally, vulnerability as a business leader. The first thing is around being open to risk and failure. These are words that any business leader will wince at. No one likes risk, no one likes failure. But you do need to make room for uncertainty. Again, things don't work first time. Like sometimes they do, but more often than not, they don't. And it's good to remember that creativity, innovation, growth, these things are bred out of moments of uncertainty. But in order to do this well, the main thing I'd say for leaders is to have budget and resources that's allocated to failure, to risk, have a contingency plan. When you don't have a contingency plan or when you don't make room for things failing, that's when things really start going wrong and everyone feels the pressure and it creates a really horrible environment to work in. It's really important for you to have this sort of flexibility and openness to new ideas as well. And I mentioned this in relation to risk and failure because new ideas can come from different people that don't think the same way as you or come from a different background. So you kind of need to have a bit of trust here. You need to lean into other people's experiences. And sometimes some ideas are going to be trialed out, or you're going to be listening to someone else and someone else's expertise. You'll try something new and it fails or it doesn't work in the way that you expected. But you do need to make that room for experimentation and for failure as well, because new ideas and new thinking can only improve the quality of the output over time. So again, good to remember that, great work doesn't happen in silos. And if you do want to drive innovation, it's really important for you to really connect and collaborate with people who are not like you. And sometimes that feels uncomfortable. Just a final point on this really, but we do tend to glorify the end result and not the journey. So as a leader, really important for you to talk about these failures along the way and how they helped us to get to the final result and not to just kind of wash over them like they never happened in the first place. So if you are a business leader or a team leader, remember to do this and to remind people that things go wrong along the way. This is a really big one. Drop the ego. It is hard. It takes a lot of courage to be vulnerable, especially when you have a lot of responsibility and you can't really control the outcome. A lot of people are used to using perfectionism and sort of proving themselves as a way to protect their egos and their feelings. So drop the ego. You don't need to have all of the answers. With clients and also in projects that I know that I work in, it's really hard to take on a consultative role, for example, where you're brought in to find opportunities or to highlight issues with the current state of things. But then when you report back on those things, no leader wants to look bad. No leader wants to think like, oh, have I not been doing a good job here? And sometimes what we see, not always, but sometimes we see egos and self-perseverance taking over, and this can be really, really detrimental to constructive progress within the business. So it's an important thing to try and practice. The higher up you get, the more you need to remember to drop that ego. And it's really important to share your fears and concerns, in order to get, those kind of new ideas, discuss past mistakes, but equally to learn about what's currently happening on the ground as well. But again, failure, mistakes, unexpected events, we don't need to have all the answers. We don't need to be in control of everything all the time, but it's just about being humble and, to glorify the process again, so that you can have that willingness to be open and to discuss these things with your team openly and transparently. One way that I could say that leaders can try and mitigate this in a way, again, is to listen to a lot of different opinions and to make evidence-based decisions. So the more you can gather data around you from trusted sources, or the more business data you can capture, the less uncomfortable you might feel. There's always going to be a level of insecurity when you're making decisions, but this is a good way to try and mitigate this as much as possible. And finally, this point around actions that are led by values. Having a really clear vision and strategy, not just for yourself, but for your business. Like, who are you? Like, what is this business? Like, what are you not? And having those really clear boundaries it's really important, because you're not going to please everyone. And you need to make sure that your organization as a whole is empowered and driven by a shared mission, something that everyone can kind of understand and get behind, and that you're hiring people based on a shared sense of values or a code of conduct, so that everyone, again, is behaving in similar ways and driving forward in the same way. And I kind of mentioned this because we mentioned this earlier, but it's good to remember that a leader isn't responsible for that performance and maybe the results even. You're responsible for the people who are responsible for the results. So it's about creating that environment that helps everyone else get to it and get the work done in the right way to generate those results that you want to see. So when you do get to a point when you're making big decisions, it's important to let your values and principles guide those decisions and your overall direction and your actions. I'll bring in Brené Brown again, that lady that I mentioned earlier. In a lot of the research that she conducted on courage and leadership, it was this ability to embrace vulnerability that really emerged as a prerequisite to a lot of other like daring leadership behaviors. And ultimately, if you can't handle uncertainty, risk, emotional exposure in a way that aligns with your values and that it furthers your organizational goals, then you will really struggle to lead. And this great little quote here from CEO of Starbucks, but vulnerability is just about the hardest thing about being a leader. Human connection is what makes you a great leader. It's not about the toughness or about being all-knowing, but it's a real balancing act, because it's about creating that right environment that enables people to perform and succeed whilst allowing for failure and imperfection. So we've spoken a lot about collaboration, innovation, but I just wanted to quickly bring this example that really brings to life this situation, which is relatable, I think, to most people, like regardless of what industry you work in. Now, let's imagine someone is having poor performance and you're having to deal with that. So their performance KPIs and maybe promotion targets are intrinsically linked with a skill set that they actually need more development in. So in a situation or environment where everyone's avoiding vulnerability, the individual is masking their feelings. They're really uncomfortable. They don't want to admit that they have a problem or that they need help. The manager isn't really exploring the individual's needs honestly and openly and creating that space to be able to do that. They're reprimanding the individual for not meeting targets, and they're not really opening up the discussion for kind of training and development. And as a leader, maybe there's no real company values around investment in people. There's no training budget. There's a very low threshold for low performance, like very low patience for that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of pressure in there. So ultimately, you will just have prolonged or consistent poor performance, an unhappy team, and potentially high staff turnover. Well, on the other hand, if you're leaning into vulnerability, the individual will feel safe to admit that they need help. They will reach out to their manager. They won't wait for the manager to go, hey, what's wrong? The person will self-assess and go, hey, actually, I think I need help with this. The manager will be role modeling that vulnerability, creating that safe space for them. They will discuss that individual's needs and put a plan in place to support their progression. And as a leader, they have built this psychologically safe environment by allocating resources for staff development, and they will have strong company values that are adhered throughout the organization. So not only just values, but everyone that they've hired, the environments that they've got is set up for all of this taking place. So the outcome of this is that you'll have increased performance, an enhanced kind of connection and trust with your team over time, and higher staff retention as well. So this is just an example that hopefully anyone can kind of relate to. These are just, the kind of top tips that we just covered. Emotional vulnerability looks different for everyone. Everyone will kind of relate to different points here. So what feels vulnerable for you will be really different for what feels vulnerable for me and vice versa. But over time, it will become easier. And the more you practice it, the more you'll be able to experience the benefits as well. So if you're struggling with vulnerability, generally, you don't know where to start, the biggest tip that I can give you is to start with yourself. It's allowing yourself to acknowledge what makes you uncomfortable and really dig into why, to really start building that self-awareness and start building on that self-care, the compassion towards yourself. And ultimately, if you start with yourself, then you can start to authentically open up and build that connection with other people. Because ultimately, if you can't love yourself, then how the hell are you going to love somebody else? Can I have an amen in here for anyone that likes RuPaul? Thank you very much, everyone. I hope this talk has helped shine a perspective on vulnerability that inspires you to practice it a little bit more in your day-to-day. So thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, Luiza. Yes, so much useful information in there. Hopefully everyone watching this found this valuable and will now feel a bit more comfortable being a little bit more vulnerable. If anyone has any questions, please do submit them using the Q&A box just at the bottom of your Zoom window. I can run through as many questions as I can. We've got about 10 minutes. But yeah, Luiza, kind of what you were saying about gender norms, kind of, is this something that is really still affecting people at work now, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think so for sure. I read this really interesting report from McKinsey not long ago. It was a report that came out in 2022, and it was mentioning how female employees and leaders are leaving companies in unprecedented numbers. They're even calling it something, I think it was like the great breakup that they're calling it. It's like a funny term, but again, it just kind of points to how, like I said, some traditionally female qualities maybe are not as valued or rewarded in the workplace. So for example, efforts that people make to foster inclusion or to support employee well-being. And I know both men and women who are doing this at work, but that's not really something that's rewarded or something that is recognized. But it's something that takes a lot of effort and a lot of time, and it's increasingly important in our workplace. But I think that there's things like that I think are really interesting to kind of keep an eye on. What are those efforts and those qualities which, for maybe just for traditional or historical reasons, we haven't really valued in the past. But as managers and leaders, I think we all need to start paying a little bit more attention to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's probably an argument that it's the wider society, as well as just in the workplace. Let me just check. We haven't got any questions in there yet. So if anyone does think of anything, then please do ask us. So Luiza, if someone wanted to do kind of any formal training on this, is there anything kind of formal that you'd recommend?
Other than therapy? It's really hard to say. Like I said, vulnerability looks different for everyone. So the things that you might struggle with will be very different from mine. So I think starting from a point of self-awareness, so you can really dig into what is it exactly that I'm uncomfortable with, and what are the sort of barriers that I'm facing, whether it's a struggle with the environment itself, or whether it's an internal hurdle that I'm having, something like maybe I'm getting in my own way. And once you can kind of identify that, you can try and find some specific training that will be valuable to you. I do know that there are leadership courses out there that focus on vulnerability. I've seen a few online. I haven't tried them personally, but all I can say is that there is so much value in developing your soft skills. I think in a lot of companies or even kind of creative agencies or lots of environments, people focus a lot on the sort of technical development and technical training. But I would say that the soft skills training is the most valuable training that I've had throughout my entire career, because it's the stuff that really sticks, and it's the stuff that's transferable across like any job that you have.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've got a couple of questions here in the Q&A section. First of all, will the slides be shared with attendees? Yes, I believe they will, and yeah, the recording of this session will be up on YouTube a bit later on today. So yeah, do keep an eye on the YouTube channel for that. So we've got a question here from Rachel. Rachel asks, how do you recommend that we approach leaders who reject vulnerability as a strength, but rather see it as a weakness? Are there methods that will help us shift the approach?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think one of the key things that I learned in management training actually is that one of the things that is really hard, especially in business, is to remove your own emotion from a situation. So whenever you're talking to people about maybe uncomfortable situations or things that maybe have happened that are not ideal, or things that you'd like to change, it's really good for you to think about, okay, what was the situation? What was the impact of that situation? And what could we do about it? And to really focus on being really objective about, so if we're thinking in business, like what is it that's going to be impacted? Or if the situation continues, what is the impact? If we solve the situation, what is the potential uplift that we can have? So one thing, and I know my dad's always given me really great advice in terms, he calls it the ice helmet. So in certain situations where you're feeling a bit like annoyed or flustered, or you feel yourself getting quite emotional about things, especially if you're dealing with people that won't react very well to that, it's really good to kind of come in with a cool head and come in with a good solid argument that's objective, but that helps people see that what you're saying isn't just an emotional outburst, which is what they will see, but there's kind of sound reasoning, and there's a reason why these things are important. There's a reason why these things have a negative impact on either yourself and your team, etc. If you can boil it down to how much it's costing them, that is usually great. That's going to get them to pay attention. But I think this question is great in of itself, because you saw from my tips that you have tips as an individual, as a team leader, or as a business leader. But you saw from the case study that all it takes is for one of those layers to not be leaning into vulnerability, and things start to crumble or things start to not work very well. So it is important for everyone to be bought into this. It's much easier to go through this if you work in a company that is open to operating in this way and that values these ways of thinking. It's much, much harder, and it will feel like an uphill struggle if you work in an environment where team and business leaders don't adhere to this way of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. We have one more question here that has just popped up. Do you believe age has a part to play with how vulnerable someone feels they can be? For instance, being young in the industry and having those around you already judge your opinion and or ideas as immature. And of course, the other way around also.
Yeah, I think that that's a great question, because I do think that I know that I really struggled with my vulnerability a lot more when I was starting off in my career, because if you're working with other people with more experience, you'd be like, anything I say, will it have any value? Am I going to come across as silly, or how much weight does my idea have? But more often than not, I realized that that was more of like an internal hurdle that I had, where it was my own insecurity of feeling like I couldn't have agency or couldn't have a space to speak up. And I think equally, if maybe you are, if you've been in a certain job for a really long time and you have new people coming in with these fresh ideas, you might feel a bit vulnerable and saying like, am I spitting out the same ideas over and over? Like, how am I bringing something fresh? You have these new people coming in with these really new ways of thinking and perspectives that, like, I feel like I'm outdated. So, everyone has their own their own insecurities, I think, and everyone fears being judged or being ostracized for what you have to bring to the table. But again, remember the tip around the judgment. I think this is something that can be applied for everyone, but especially if you are a team leader, or managing a team, or trying to create a space where people feel comfortable coming to you with ideas. It's really important that if someone does come up with an idea, and it's maybe not the best idea ever, but it's an idea, that we're not putting that judgment on the idea, because it might put someone off from sharing their ideas in the future. And you never know who has a winning idea up their sleeve. It could be anyone, it could come from anywhere. So the best thing that I can say is just to have courage to speak up for your ideas. And if someone poo-poos your idea, like, then that's more of a reflection on them than a reflection on you.
Well said. Awesome. So that is just about all we've got time for. So thank you to everyone that tuned in. Thank you very much, Luiza. That was fantastic. Yeah, we're going to have the recording available for you ASAP. So keep an eye on our YouTube channel. That should arrive on there a bit later on this afternoon. Our next webinar, called My First UX Job, Things I Wish I Was Told, is taking place on 30th of May. And that's hosted by UX consultant here at Nomensa, Harriet Hughes. And that's going to be full of tips for both starters in UX and also those managing starters. Sign-ups are now open, and that's up on our Eventbrite page now. We've got lots and lots of other events coming up as well, including virtually our free accessibility conference on 16th to the 18th of May. Collaborate, our in-person Bristol conference in June, with tickets selling really fast, and Interact London in October, where tickets will be going on sale very soon. So please do keep an eye for when that's up online. So again, thank you all for tuning in. Luiza, thank you, and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.